For 35 years, James Carter believed he knew everything about his wife, Elaine. They met in college, built a life together, raised 2 children, and shared the kind of love people envied. Their friends called them inseparable. Their neighbors described them as the perfect couple. But then, one letter changed everything. It arrived in an unmarked envelope. No return address. Just his name, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. At first, he thought it was junk mail. But the moment he opened it, his hands trembled. Inside, a single sheet of paper. A few lines of text. Simple. Direct. James, there's something you need to know about Elaine. He read the words again. And again. His mind raced, his pulse quickened. The letter didn't accuse her of anything directly. It didn't explain. It only left him with a question that clawed at the edges of his sanity. What was it he needed to know? At first, he told himself it was a mistake. A prank. Someone trying to stir trouble. But then, he found it. Hidden in the back of her closet. A small wooden box, locked. A box he had never seen before. For 35 years, he trusted her. For 35 years, he believed he knew her. But what he discovered inside that box changed everything. James and Elaine Patterson had the kind of love that people envied. High school sweethearts, together for over 3 decades, their bond seemed unshakable. Their life, from the outside, was something out of a storybook. Vacations to the coast, Christmas mornings with their children and grandchildren, birthdays filled with laughter and candles flickering in the warm glow of their family home. They lived in a small, quiet town, one of those places where everyone knew everyone. A town where doors were left unlocked, neighbors waved from their porches, and people gathered at the local diner to catch up on the latest news. The Pattersons were well loved. James, a retired school principal, had spent years shaping young minds, while Elaine dedicated her life to their home and community, always the first to bring a casserole when someone fell ill or to organize church events. Their world was peaceful, predictable, safe. And then, there was Mark Reynolds. Mark had lived next door to them for nearly 20 years. A bachelor, easygoing, always willing to lend a hand. He helped James fix the gutters after storms, shoveled their driveway in the winter, and watched their home when they were away. Elaine often joked that he was like an extension of their family. He had dinner with them on occasion, spent holidays in their home when he didn't have anywhere else to be. He was trusted, respected, appreciated. But what James didn't know was that Mark had been part of their marriage in ways he could never imagine. If James had ever stopped to notice, he might have questioned the way Mark always seemed to be around. How he always knew when Elaine was home alone. How he always managed to show up when James was busy at work, offering to help with little things around the house. If James had looked a little closer, he might have seen the way Mark's eyes lingered on Elaine. The way he laughed a little too much at her jokes, stood a little too close when they spoke. The way she never quite met Mark's gaze when James was in the room. But James never questioned it. Why would he? Mark was their friend. A good friend. The kind of friend who was always just there. And maybe that was the problem. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are the ones hiding in plain sight. At first, James brushed it off. A misplaced thought. A fleeting doubt. Elaine had always been warm, affectionate, his safe harbor. But lately, something felt off. It started small. A subtle shift in the way she moved around him. The way her fingers trembled just slightly when she locked her phone screen. The way her laughter, once free and unburdened, now carried an edge of hesitation. Then came the excuses. The quick, almost rehearsed responses. "Oh, I was just texting my sister. Just a work thing, nothing important." The kind of explanations that, on their own, seemed harmless. But they piled up, each one leaving a faint trace of doubt in his mind. The next-door visits were unusual. Elaine had never been particularly friendly with the neighbors. And yet, she suddenly found reasons, every single day, to drop by. A cup of sugar. A missing spice. A recipe she simply had to borrow. At first, James had smiled at the absurdity of it. But then he noticed how her body tensed when he asked about it. How she'd turn away quickly, as if afraid her expression might betray something. And then, the whispers. The first time, He heard them faintly through the walls. A murmur of words, too hushed to make out, spoken with urgency. It was late, past midnight. James had stirred from sleep, groggy, reaching for Elaine, only to find the bed beside him empty. He followed the sound. Through the darkened hallway, the faint glow of a screen illuminated the living room. There she stood, back to him, clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. "No, not yet. I can't just—" Her voice was strained, quiet but frantic. James cleared his throat. She spun around so fast, the phone nearly slipped from her grip. For a split second, her face was unreadable, just a flicker of something he couldn't place. Then, like a mask slipping into place, she smiled. "Just my mom," she whispered, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She couldn't sleep. A plausible explanation. But James knew her mother. And he knew her mother never called this late. Still, he nodded. Let it go. And maybe he would have continued to let it go, ignored the pit in his stomach, convinced himself it was nothing, if not for what he found the next morning. The moment he saw it, his breath hitched. A slow, creeping dread coiled around his ribs, squeezing tight. Because there, on the kitchen counter, left carelessly as if it meant nothing, was something that sent chills down his spine. Something that changed everything. James's fingers trembled as he held the letter, his breath shallow. The ink, though faded, carried the weight of something forbidden, something secret. The paper itself was fragile, crinkling slightly under his grip as he adjusted it in the dim attic light. His pulse quickened. He swallowed hard and looked at the next letter in the stack. The date, 1992. The same handwriting. The same desperate tone. "I dream of you every night. I trace the outline of your name in the dark. Do you still think of me when you wake up next to her?" James exhaled slowly, his stomach tightening. The words curled around him like a noose. This wasn't just any love letter. It was an affair. A long, hidden betrayal. His fingers flipped through the stack. 1995, 1997, 2001. The years rolled by in ink-stained confessions. Whoever M was, they had been there, lurking in the shadows of his family for decades. He clenched his jaw and kept reading. "I watched you from across the street today. You looked happy. I should be happy for you. But I'm not." A sharp chill ran down his spine. His eyes darted around the attic, as if expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. The old wooden beams groaned under the weight of years, and the single bulb overhead flickered slightly. He reached for another letter. 2010. The handwriting was more erratic now, ink smudged in places. "You promised me. You said when the time was right. How much longer will I have to wait?" James inhaled sharply, the words feeling heavier now, their weight pressing against his chest. He wasn't sure if he wanted to keep going. But he had to. Then, his fingers brushed against something different. A crisp, white envelope. The paper felt new. His heart pounded as he turned it over, his breath catching in his throat. "Last week." His hands shook as he slid the letter out. The attic seemed to close in around him, the air thick, suffocating. "I can't do this anymore. I've waited long enough. You owe me. If you won't come to me, I'll come to you." James felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He looked around again, a deep unease settling in his bones. Someone had been here. Someone had placed this letter where he would find it. And they were still waiting. James had felt it for weeks, an unsettling shift in Elaine's behavior. The late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. The sudden, inexplicable need for privacy. The absence of warmth in her touch. He had ignored it, told himself it was just his imagination, that work stress was making him paranoid. But suspicion, once planted, only grows. So, on this particular evening, James makes a decision. He leaves home earlier than usual, just like he always does. He kisses Elaine goodbye, his lips barely brushing against hers, and walks out the door. He counts his steps, each one deliberate, then rounds the corner. But instead of heading to his car, he turns back, slipping into the shadows of the alleyway beside their home. He waits. Minutes pass, then an hour. The street is quiet except for the occasional passing car, its headlights washing over the pavement like fleeting ghosts. And then, It happens. A faint creak from the back door. James presses himself against the wall, holding his breath as he watches. Elaine steps out cautiously, glancing around as if to ensure no one is watching. But James is watching. He sees her slip into the night, her pace quick, purposeful. And then he sees something else. She isn't just leaving. She's heading in one direction. Straight toward Mark's house. The weight in James' chest grows heavier, pressing against his ribs like a vice. He doesn't follow her, not yet. He doesn't need to. He already knows. But knowing isn't enough. He needs proof. That night, James puts his plan into motion. It isn't difficult. Elaine has grown too comfortable, too certain that her deception is airtight. He sets up a small recorder, hidden discreetly behind a framed picture on the shelf. It's voice-activated, designed to capture even the softest whispers. Then, he waits. Hours pass. The house is silent. James sits in the dark, his hands curled into fists, listening to the quiet hum of the clock ticking on the wall. It's almost 2 a.m. when the front door clicks open. Footsteps. The rustle of a coat being hung up. And then, a voice. Elaine's. James forces himself to stay still, to breathe evenly, as she paces the living room. There's another sound, faint at first, then clearer, her phone dialing. A pause. Then Mark answers. James clenches his jaw. I can't keep lying to him, Mark. Elaine's voice trembles. But I don't want to lose you. Silence. James feels his entire world collapse inward, the weight of betrayal crashing down with suffocating force. He listens to every word, every hesitation, every sigh. He doesn't hear guilt. He doesn't hear regret. Just fear. Fear of losing the man she's betraying him with. The recording continues for minutes, each second stretching endlessly. And then, finally, she hangs up. James doesn't move. He lets the darkness swallow him whole. The next morning, James doesn't go to work. Instead, he waits. Elaine moves around the house as if nothing has changed, as if their world isn't crumbling beneath them. Then, there's a knock at the door. Elaine. James watches as Elaine greets her, their voices soft, almost conspiratorial. They sit at the kitchen table, and for a moment, James feels like an outsider in his own home. He doesn't hesitate. He steps forward. The chair scrapes loudly against the floor as he sits down across from them. Silence falls. Elaine's eyes widen slightly and she looks away. James exhales slowly, the weight of the truth sitting heavy in the air between them. Then, without a word, he pulls out his phone. Presses play. Elaine's voice fills the room. I can't keep lying to him, Mark. But I don't want to lose you. Elaine's reaction is immediate. Her head snaps up, her face draining of color. Elaine, however, stays frozen. James watches them both, his face unreadable. And then, finally, he speaks. How long? Elaine swallows hard. James, how long? Tears well up in her eyes. She opens her mouth, closes it again. Then, finally, a whisper. It was never meant to happen, her voice cracks. But I couldn't stop. The words land like a final blow, confirming what James already knew. Elaine stares at the table, unable to meet his gaze. James looks at them both, his heart pounding in his ears. And then, quietly, he stands. There's nothing left to say. And just like that, the world James thought he knew collapsed around him. Elaine's affair wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It was a deception that predated their vows, a betrayal woven into the very fabric of their marriage. But as the weight of this revelation pressed down on him, the truth unraveled even further. Because Mark wasn't just her lover. He was possibly the father of James's eldest son. The DNA test results were undeniable. The son James had raised, loved, and protected for years wasn't his. The room was suffocatingly silent as James read the paper again, and again, hoping the words would change. They didn't. His hands trembled. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. Elaine, the woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, had been lying to him since the beginning. His son, no, the boy he had believed was his son, wasn't biologically his. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him. Betrayal. Rage. Grief. But just as James struggled to process this devastating truth, Elaine spoke again. And her words sent a fresh chill through the room. But James wasn't the only one betrayed. A sharp intake of breath. Because Elaine was hiding something from Mark too. James's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. What the hell did she mean? Mark, too, looked stricken. His face, once filled with smug confidence, now held a flicker of uncertainty. Elaine's fingers trembled as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She was unraveling now. The control she once held over this tangled web was slipping. She licked her lips, hesitated, then finally spoke. Mark, you don't know everything. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, she said it. There's another DNA test. Mark's brow furrowed. James's stomach twisted. Elaine's voice wavered. It's not just James's son we tested. The room seemed to shrink. James could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Elaine's next words were barely above a whisper, yet they cut through the silence like a blade. Mark, we tested your daughter too. A slow, creeping realization dawned on Mark's face. His daughter. His little girl. The one he had fought to protect, to love, to provide for. Elaine's lips trembled. She isn't yours. Mark stumbled backward as if the words had struck him physically. No, his voice was hoarse, weak. That's impossible. Elaine didn't respond. She didn't have to. The paper in her shaking hands said it all. Mark snatched the document, his eyes scanning the results, his breath catching in his throat. His daughter, the child he had believed was his own, wasn't biologically his. James watched, frozen in place. He had spent the last several minutes drowning in his own betrayal, in his own heartbreak. But now, watching Mark crumble before him, he realized something. Elaine hadn't just betrayed him. She had betrayed them both. Their lives were nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. Mark's grip on the paper tightened until his knuckles turned white. His voice shook with disbelief, rage, devastation. Who? The single word echoed through the room. Elaine flinched. But she didn't answer. Mark's hands balled into fists at his sides. His entire world had just been ripped apart, and now he needed the truth. Who is her real father, Elaine? She hesitated. Too long. And that hesitation was enough. James felt the air shift. Something darker was coming. Something neither of them were ready for. Because the truth Elaine was about to reveal would change everything. Betrayal is one thing. Being used as a pawn in someone else's game is another. James feels it settle deep in his bones, the weight of it, the sickening twist of truth. Elaine never loved him. Not in the way he thought. Not in the way he needed. She had been engaged before. To Mark. The name alone sends a shiver through him. Mark, the man James had always considered a stranger, an afterthought. A man he had only met once, briefly, at a fundraiser years ago. He had shaken Mark's hand, looked him in the eye. Back then, he hadn't known. Back then, he had no reason to care. But now he understands. Elaine had left Mark at the altar. And Mark had never forgiven her. James's stomach twists. It's not just the betrayal of an affair. It's the realization that this wasn't passion. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't love. This was revenge. A slow, deliberate game, played in the dark, with him as the fool in the center of it all. James turns to Elaine. Her expression is unreadable. Cold. Detached. And that, somehow, is the worst part. She doesn't deny it. She doesn't plead. She just watches. James was never meant to be her forever. Just a stepping stone. A means to an end. A pawn. And suddenly, the heartbreak curdles into something sharper. Something darker. Fear. James, soft, to himself. I wasn't just betrayed. I was played. His mind races back, retracing every moment. Every glance. Every kiss. The first time she told him she loved him. The first time she looked at him like he was her world. Was it all a lie? Or worse, was there a moment, even just one, where it had been real? He wants to ask. He wants to demand the truth. But his throat is tight, his breath shallow. And then, a noise. A shift in the air behind him. James turns. Mark stands in the doorway. He's been here the whole time. Watching. Waiting. A slow smile spreads across Mark's lips. Not triumphant. Not mocking. Something colder. Something final. Elaine doesn't flinch. She doesn't react at all. James realizes, in that moment, that this was always the endgame. This wasn't just about Elaine. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about him. And it isn't over yet. James files for divorce. The papers arrive in a thick envelope, heavier than they should be, weighed down by everything they represent. A life built together, 15 years of memories, laughter, pain, and sacrifice, reduced to legal jargon and signatures. He hesitates before opening it, running his fingers along the seal, as if breaking it will make everything real. But it is real. It has been real. And yet, somehow, none of it was ever real at all. Elaine signs without hesitation. There is no fight, no anger, no pleading. She simply accepts it. Maybe, in her own way, she is relieved. Maybe she, too, has been carrying the weight of a life she no longer recognizes. Then, she leaves. No long goodbye, no final conversation. Just a single note left on the kitchen counter, next to the coffee machine she once used every morning. I never meant to hurt you. I hope you can find peace. That's it. That's all she gives him. 15 years together, and that's how it ends. Mark follows her. He always does. But what they have was built on secrecy, deception, stolen moments in the dark. And when everything is out in the open, the illusion shatters. What was once intoxicating, dangerous, exhilarating, becomes something ugly, something exposed. The world sees them now. The whispers, the judgment, the guilt that they once ignored, it all becomes too much. Their love doesn't survive. Elaine moves to a new city. Mark, desperate to hold on, follows. But love, real love, is more than passion. More than secrecy. More than the thrill of getting away with something. When that's gone, what's left? Nothing. Their arguments grow louder. The silences stretch longer. He reaches for her, and she pulls away. He asks if she still loves him, and she doesn't answer. Eventually, he stops asking. And then, one day, she leaves him too. James sits alone in the house they once shared. The walls are too quiet now. The bed is too big. The smell of her perfume has faded, replaced by something colder, emptier. He finds himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, even though he knows they'll never come. And then, a thought. A slow, creeping realization that wraps around him like a vice. I spent my whole life loving someone who was never really mine. The weight of it crushes him. Not just the betrayal. Not just the loss. But the time, the years he can never get back. The version of his life he thought was real, erased in an instant. He wonders if he ever really knew her at all. If she ever really loved him. He stares at the empty chair across from him at the dinner table, the place where she used to sit. The ghost of a life that never truly existed. And then, the final question. The question that lingers long after the story is over, echoing in the minds of those who hear it. What would you do if your entire marriage was a lie? And what would you have done in James' situation? Would you have trusted him, or walked away? Do you think James should have seen the warning signs earlier, or was this betrayal impossible to predict? If you were in his shoes, would you have taken revenge, or chosen to move on? Let's be honest, was James the real victim here, or did he bring this on himself? What do you think was the biggest mistake James made? Let me know in the comments. Some say trust is earned. Others say it's given freely, until it's broken. Where do you stand? If you had to describe this situation in one word, what would it be? Drop it below. Do you believe in second chances? Would you have forgiven? Have you ever experienced a moment like this? A time when someone you trusted turned on you? Tell me, who's the real villain in this story? The one who lied, or the one who believed? If you could give James one piece of advice before all of this happened, what would it be? And here's a question. Do you think this was fate, or a consequence of his own choices? Maybe this wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was just survival. What do you think? The story is over, but the discussion isn't. I want to hear your thoughts.